My dear friend, there is a quietness surrounding you that nobody else seems able to hear. Not the kind of silence that comes from being alone, but the kind that appears just before destiny begins to speak. You have been feeling it lately, haven't you? That strange sensation pulling gently at your chest. Those moments when your heart suddenly becomes heavy without any obvious reason. The memories that return at the most unexpected hours. The feeling that someone, somewhere is thinking about you with an intensity they can no longer pretend does not exist. Something is unfolding beneath the surface of your life. And tonight, your soul was guided toward this message for a reason. Because the soul connected to yours has reached a point where hiding what they feel is becoming almost impossible. They miss you more deeply than they know how to put into words. What you may not yet understand is that their silence was never evidence that they stopped caring. It was fear. It was uncertainty. It was timing. It was old wounds they had never fully learned how to understand or heal. And even now, during those moments when everything around them becomes quiet, your energy seems to return to their thoughts like waves moving beneath a hidden moon. That may be why your own spirit has felt restless lately. That may be why certain songs suddenly seem to carry a different meaning. Why familiar places unexpectedly awaken emotions you thought had already faded. Why your intuition continues whispering that something is approaching. Because something is approaching. And the conversation moving in your direction will not be an ordinary conversation. It may loosen something that has remained tightly held inside both of you. But before that moment arrives, there are certain truths your heart needs to understand. Because if this message had reached you too early, perhaps you would have dismissed it. And if it had arrived too late, perhaps your heart would have already locked the door and refused to listen. The person your soul continues returning to has been fighting emotions they can no longer outrun. They tried distracting themselves. They tried telling themselves they were perfectly fine. They tried convincing their mind that moving forward was easier than looking backward. They buried themselves in routines, responsibilities, conversations, work, obligations, and endless movement. They filled their days so completely that there would supposedly be no room left for thoughts of you. Yet somehow, your presence continued returning quietly, unexpectedly, and powerfully. It came back when they least expected it. A familiar memory, a certain place, a song, a passing thought, a quiet moment before sleep. Somehow, you kept appearing without being invited, not because you are controlling them, not because you have some supernatural hold over their thoughts, not because you are forcing your way into their mind, but because some connections leave fingerprints on the soul. Some encounters touch a place within us that ordinary experiences cannot reach. And lately, your absence has become something they can no longer simply silence or ignore. There is something they have wanted to tell you for a very long time. Something they have rehearsed over and over again in private. Words they carefully constructed inside their mind but never allowed themselves to release into the world. They imagined how they would say it. They imagined your reaction. They imagined what might happen afterward. Yet each time they came close to expressing themselves, fear stepped in and pulled them backward. Not because the feelings were weak, but because the feelings were powerful. Powerful enough to expose everything they worked so hard to keep hidden. Vulnerability has always frightened them more than sleepless nights ever could. They would rather carry an emotion silently than take the risk of admitting how deeply they actually feel. They would rather appear unaffected than allow someone to see the fragile truth beneath their defenses. But something has been changing slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. The walls they once depended on for protection no longer feel as strong as they used to. The distance they once created to protect themselves no longer feels safe. The silence that once gave them comfort has gradually become unbearable. What once felt like control now feels like emptiness. What once seemed like freedom now feels like a question they cannot escape. Perhaps that explains something you have been experiencing within yourself lately. Your own emotions may have become stronger. Unexpected sadness, unexpected memories, sudden waves of emotion arriving without warning. Moments when you feel deeply connected to something you cannot logically explain. You may have wondered whether it was simply coincidence. Maybe you thought it was nostalgia. Maybe you assumed your heart was simply remembering the past. But there may be more happening beneath those feelings than you realize, because when two people remain deeply connected emotionally, the heart can sometimes sense movement before the conscious mind understands what is happening. And something is moving, something is shifting, something is changing. Neither of you may be able to stop the process now. What makes this connection so powerful is that the separation between you was never necessarily punishment, it was preparation. There were lessons that could only be learned through distance. There were truths that could only become visible through absence. There were parts of each person that needed to grow independently before the connection could ever be understood clearly. I know there were nights when you questioned yourself. Moments when you wondered why someone who seemed so deeply connected to your spirit could suddenly disappear into silence. You replayed conversations. You examined small details. You searched for hidden meanings. You remembered things they said and things they did not say. You carried questions that nobody seemed capable of answering, yet what felt like rejection often had very little to do with your worth. Their struggle was happening inside themselves. They were fighting battles involving fear, timing, uncertainty, emotional responsibility, and feelings they simply were not prepared to confront. And because they could not face those emotions, they stepped away from them. Unfortunately, stepping away from those emotions also meant stepping away from you. For a period of time, they convinced themselves that distance would solve everything. They believed time would weaken the connection. They believed eventually they would stop thinking about you. They believed the memories would become less powerful. They believed they would stop missing you. They believed they would eventually feel nothing. But the opposite happened. Distance created clarity. Silence created realization. Absence created understanding. The farther they moved away, the more emotionally aware they became. Instead of forgetting, they began noticing how often you still appeared in their thoughts. Instead of becoming indifferent, they became more conscious of what your absence actually meant. Instead of losing the connection emotionally, they began recognizing how deeply it had affected them. And now they are beginning to understand something they can no longer easily deny. Some people enter your life and permanently change the emotional landscape of your world. They do not always arrive with dramatic gestures. They do not always arrive at the perfect time. They may not even realize the impact they are having when it happens. Sometimes it is simply their presence, the way they speak, the way they understand you, the way being around them makes something inside you feel recognized. You became one of those people, a person they unconsciously compare others to, a person whose absence still echoes through ordinary moments, a person whose memory can appear from nowhere and suddenly change the emotional atmosphere of an entire day. A song can bring you back, a familiar scent can bring you back, a certain hour of the night can bring you back, a random place can bring you back. Even an ordinary conversation can somehow remind them of you. And every time it happens, they experience the same emotion, longing. The kind of longing that arrives unexpectedly and refuses to disappear. The kind that follows someone into the quiet hours of the night. The kind that leaves them staring into darkness, wondering whether they waited too long. Wondering whether they allowed something precious to slip away. Wondering whether they lost something they were never truly meant to lose. Recently, those thoughts have become even stronger because they are approaching a crossroads. One path leads back into silence. The familiar path, the safer path. The path where they say nothing and continue pretending they are unaffected. The other path leads toward truth, toward honesty, toward vulnerability, toward finally speaking the words that have remained hidden for so long. The decision standing before them is becoming increasingly difficult to avoid, and the closer they move toward that decision, the louder your presence becomes inside them. That is why your intuition may feel different lately. That is why your spirit keeps sensing movement, because deep down, a part of you already knows that something is changing. This story is not finished. The chapter that appeared to be closed may have only been paused. The silence may have been an interruption rather than an ending. And somewhere tonight, while you continue living your life, while you continue healing, growing, learning, and becoming stronger than you realize, Someone else may be carrying your name inside their heart with more intensity than ever before. They may not completely understand what they are feeling. They may not know exactly what comes next. They may still have fears they need to overcome. They may still be wrestling with questions they have not answered. But one thing has become increasingly difficult for them to deny. The night only went quiet for a while. And now, after all this time, something is preparing to speak again. The hidden truth is this: the separation did not necessarily destroy the connection. It revealed it. Because some people only understand the value of a presence after experiencing its absence. And your absence taught them lessons your presence never could. It taught them what mattered. It taught them what remained. It taught them which emotions were genuine and which were temporary. It taught them that distraction cannot erase attachment. It taught them that distance does not automatically create indifference. It taught them that silence can sometimes make feelings louder rather than weaker. And no matter how hard they tried to move forward without confronting those truths continued following them. They appeared in quiet moments. They appeared in memories. They appeared in comparisons. They appeared in the spaces where you used to exist. Now they are standing at the edge of a decision that could change everything, a decision that requires courage, a decision that asks them to become emotionally honest in a way they have never been before. For a long time, they believed hiding their feelings would protect them. They thought if they never admitted how deeply they cared, they could never be hurt by what those feelings might demand from them. They thought silence gave them power, but slowly they are discovering that silence can also become its own form of pain. Because when someone keeps running from an emotion, the emotion does not necessarily disappear. Sometimes it grows stronger in the places where it is never acknowledged. And that may be what has been happening within them. They have been trying to understand why, despite everything, you still matter. Why your memory still carries emotional weight. Why certain moments still remind them of you. Why they can move through an entire day without thinking about you and then suddenly feel your absence with overwhelming intensity. They may have asked themselves whether it is simply memory, but deep down they know it is more complicated than that. You touched something in them that they could not simply replace. You awakened feelings they were not prepared to carry. You made them see parts of themselves that they had avoided for years. And sometimes, when another person becomes connected to our deeper emotional world, walking away from them also means walking away from a part of ourselves that they helped reveal. That is why the distance has been so difficult. That is why the silence has started to feel heavier. That is why the possibility of speaking again has begun to feel less frightening than the possibility of never speaking at all. There is a moment approaching where they may finally have to choose between protecting their pride and honoring their truth, between remaining comfortable and becoming vulnerable, between pretending they have moved on and admitting that something inside them never truly did. And when that moment arrives, remember this: you do not have to chase it. You do not have to force it. You do not have to convince anyone of your value. You do not have to prove that you are worthy of being remembered. If someone has truly recognized what your presence meant, they will have to confront that realization within themselves. Your role is not to force their awakening. Your role is to continue becoming the person you were always meant to become. Keep healing, keep growing, keep living, keep choosing yourself. Because while you were waiting for answers, life was quietly transforming you. The version of you who experienced the separation is not exactly the same person standing here now. You have learned things. You have become stronger. You have discovered how to sit with uncertainty. You have learned that your worth does not depend on whether another person chooses to speak, and perhaps that is one of the greatest lessons hidden inside this entire story. Sometimes distance does not exist to make you forget someone. Sometimes it exists to help you remember yourself. And perhaps the person who once walked away is finally beginning to understand that truth too. They may remember your patience. They may remember your kindness. They may remember the way you looked at them when they were struggling to understand themselves. They may remember conversations that seemed ordinary at the time, but now carry an entirely different meaning. Memory has a strange way of becoming clearer with time. Things that once seemed insignificant can suddenly become precious. Words that once seemed casual can suddenly feel important. A moment that once seemed ordinary can suddenly become unforgettable. And perhaps that is why they are thinking about you now. Not because the past has trapped them, but because the past has finally taught them something. They are beginning to understand what they could not understand when you were close. They are beginning to see what your absence revealed, and they are beginning to recognize that some connections cannot simply be erased by silence. So if your heart has been feeling unusually restless, do not immediately assume that something is wrong with you. If old memories have returned, allow yourself to notice them without allowing them to control you. If certain emotions rise unexpectedly, listen to them with compassion rather than fear. You do not need to chase every feeling for an explanation. You do not need to turn every coincidence into a prediction. You simply need to remain present with yourself. Because whatever happens next, you are no longer the person who needed someone else to validate the connection in order to believe it mattered. You know what you felt. You know what you experienced. You know what the connection taught you. And if the other person is truly approaching a point of emotional honesty, their next step must come from their own understanding, their own courage, and their own willingness to speak. The silence has already taught both of you enough. The distance has already revealed enough. The unanswered questions have already changed enough. Now something different may be beginning, something more honest, something more conscious, something that no longer depends on fear controlling the conversation. So breathe. Release the need to know exactly when it will happen or precisely how it will unfold. Let the future arrive in its own time. Because sometimes the most meaningful conversations happen only after two people have grown enough to finally understand what they were unable to understand before. And perhaps the reason you were guided here tonight is not simply to tell you that someone misses you. Perhaps it is to remind you that your presence has meaning even when nobody is speaking about it. Perhaps it is to remind you that silence does not always mean absence of feeling. Perhaps it is to remind you that some chapters require distance before their true meaning becomes visible. And perhaps, somewhere beyond what you can currently see, someone is finally gathering the courage to say what they should have said long ago. The decision is approaching. The truth is becoming harder to hide. And the heart that once chose silence may finally be preparing to speak. And the closer that moment comes, the more restless their spirit begins to feel. Because deep within themselves, they already know. There are words that can no longer stay unspoken. There are emotions that can no longer remain concealed. And there is a connection that simply refuses to fade away. Comment 111 if this message resonates deeply with your spirit, my dear friend. Because what happens next is the part neither of you could have understood in the beginning. There was a time when this connection felt impossible to explain, a time when the emotions seemed far greater than the circumstances surrounding you, a time when both of you were trying to understand something your hearts had recognized long before your minds were ready to accept it. That is why this connection felt so powerful. Not because it was flawless, not because every moment was simple, but because it carried lessons that neither of you could escape. And recently, something has been shifting within them. Not all at once, not in some dramatic way, but slowly and quietly. The way morning light appears before anyone realizes the darkness is beginning to disappear. There are moments now when they pause in the middle of an ordinary day and suddenly think about you with such intensity that it catches them completely by surprise. A familiar song starts playing. A certain place reminds them of something you once talked about. A memory suddenly returns with unexpected detail. And for a few brief moments, everything around them seems to fade into the background. They may be surrounded by people, occupied with responsibilities, concentrating on something that has absolutely nothing to do with you. Yet somehow, your presence enters their thoughts anyway. Not because they deliberately call for it, but because it arrives naturally, and that has become increasingly difficult for them to ignore. For a long time, they convinced themselves they could continue moving forward without ever confronting what they truly felt. They believed enough time would eventually erase the connection. They thought distance would weaken it. They imagined that life would eventually carry them toward someone or something completely different. but every attempt to emotionally move away seemed to bring them back to the same realization. You still matter to them more than they expected, more than they intended, and more than they ever wanted to admit. And that realization has slowly been changing them from the inside outward. You see, some people are afraid of losing love, but other people are actually afraid of discovering it. Because real love asks questions that comfort never asks. It demands honesty, it requires vulnerability, it calls for courage. And courage can feel almost impossible when someone has spent years building walls around their heart. There were parts of themselves they believed would stay hidden forever. Parts they never planned to reveal to another person. Old fears, old disappointments, old wounds, and pieces of themselves they learned to conceal behind confidence and strength. Yet somehow your presence continued reaching those hidden places. Not through pressure, not through force, and not by demanding anything from them. Simply by being who you are. And that frightened them more deeply than they ever admitted. Because when someone truly sees you, it becomes much harder to continue pretending. The masks begin to feel heavier. The walls become more exhausting to maintain. The distance stops feeling as secure as it once did. Eventually, a person reaches a place where telling the truth becomes easier than continuing to run from it. That is where they are now, standing somewhere between fear and truth, between silence and expression, between the person they used to be and the person they are slowly becoming. The strange part is that they have also started noticing signs everywhere. Not necessarily huge or dramatic signs, but small ones, meaningful ones. Moments that may appear completely ordinary to everyone else, but feel impossible for them to dismiss. A conversation about love suddenly appearing when they least expect it. A memory returning at precisely the right moment. A dream that stays with them long after they wake up. A feeling appearing that they simply cannot put into words. At first, they ignored these moments. They told themselves they were coincidences. They tried to move past them without giving them any meaning. But then they started noticing how frequently these things were happening. And now they can no longer pretend they do not see them, because every little sign seems to lead their thoughts in the same direction, back toward you, and that realization has become increasingly difficult to escape. There is another truth they are only now beginning to understand. They do not simply miss your presence. They miss the way they felt when they were around you. They miss the version of themselves that seemed to emerge naturally whenever you were near. The version that felt hopeful, open, alive. The version that believed life could still surprise them with beautiful possibilities. That is what makes this so powerful, because people often believe they miss another person. But sometimes what they truly miss is the person they became while they were with that individual. And lately they have been remembering that version of themselves, the version that laughed more naturally. The version that felt emotions more deeply. The version that dreamed without constantly questioning whether those dreams were possible. The version of themselves that felt connected to you. That memory has become increasingly difficult to silence, especially during the quiet hours of the night. Because nighttime has a way of taking away distractions. When the world becomes still, the heart becomes louder. And during those quiet moments, your absence becomes almost impossible for them to ignore. That is why their emotions have become stronger. That is why their thoughts continue returning to you. That is why the distance between you no longer feels as easy for them to tolerate. For a long time, they believed silence was protecting them. Now they are beginning to realize that silence has been hurting them as well. Because every emotion left unspoken continues growing. Every truth that is avoided continues waiting. Every feeling pushed into the darkness eventually searches for a path back toward the light, and there is one particular truth they can no longer run away from. They never truly stopped caring. Perhaps they tried to stop caring. Perhaps they convinced themselves that they had already moved on. Perhaps they desperately wanted to believe that they had. But the heart has its own memory, and theirs remembers everything. The conversations, the laughter, the connection, the moments that seemed insignificant when they happened but became meaningful afterward. The things they never told you. The emotions they could never properly explain. The words they wished they had spoken when they had the opportunity. All of it is still there. And recently, those memories have become stronger than their excuses, stronger than their fears, stronger than the stories they created to convince themselves that remaining silent was easier. Something inside them is beginning to understand that not every opportunity remains available forever. Not every connection returns when you finally decide you are ready. Not every person remains within reach indefinitely. And for the first time, they are allowing themselves to consider a possibility they avoided for a very long time.